Israel Katz just said out loud what no minister in any serious democracy would dare say publicly. The Israeli defense minister, not a commentator, not a fringe politician, not an anonymous social media account, issued an official statement picked up by every major international wire service announcing that the Israeli army is ready to resume the war against Iran. The targets are already marked, and he is waiting, in his own words, for the green light from the United States to complete, he said, the elimination of the Khamenei dynasty and to bring Iran back to the Stone Age. The Stone Age. That is how a minister of a United Nations member state speaks about another United Nations member state in 2026 on camera without a single moment of hesitation. French television gave it 30 seconds between two other headlines. What it actually is one of the most dangerous declarations an Israeli minister has ever made in the middle of an active war. And not because of what it reveals about Israeli military intentions, but because of what it reveals about the world we are living in right now. That is what we are going to take apart today. Not what the Western commentators buried under the word rhetoric, not what the editorialists softened with diplomatic language, what this declaration actually means. And why this precise announcement marks a turning point in a conflict that is already among the most dangerous of the 21st century. To understand the weight of this statement, you need to know who Israel Katz is. Not a backbencher looking for attention, not a hardline activist posting from a Tel Aviv apartment. The defense minister of the state of Israel, the man with direct command authority over the IDF, the man who decides every single day which targets get struck where and with what. When a man in that exact position announces publicly that his army is waiting for American authorization to assassinate the supreme leader of another sovereign state, that is not a political declaration. That is an operational declaration. A military roadmap announced in broad daylight. And who is Mojib Khamenei, this new supreme leader that Katz wants to eliminate? He is the son of Ali Khamenei, the former supreme leader killed on the first day of this war in the coordinated American-Israeli strikes of February 28th. Mojtaba took over under extraordinarily difficult conditions. According to recent reporting, he has undergone 3 surgical procedures on his legs since the conflict began. Doctors have not ruled out the need for a prosthetic. He has not appeared publicly at any point since his appointment. He is currently directing Iran from a secret location, communicating only through written messages passed to his spokespeople. This is the man, wounded, isolated, invisible, who on April 27th transmitted a personal message to Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg. That detail is essential to understanding the full weight of Katz's threat. Mojtaba Khamenei is no longer simply the religious head of a state. He has become the symbol of Iranian resistance against a military coalition that already killed his father. And through his message to Putin, he has become a direct strategic ally of Russia. Killing him today is not merely a wartime operation, it is a direct provocation against Moscow. And that is precisely what makes the Katz declaration so dangerous. Now read the second half of that declaration carefully, because it is just as explosive as the first. Katz said, and this comes directly from official sources, that the goal is to bring Iran back to the Stone Age through the destruction of key energy and electricity installations and the dismantling of national economic infrastructure. Read that sentence slowly. Destroy energy installations, destroy electricity installations, dismantle the economic infrastructure. This is not a military strategy, this is a civilian strategy. Because the energy infrastructure of a country is the hospitals that function. It is the water purification plants. It is the cold chains that keep medicine viable. It is the traffic lights, the elevators in apartment buildings, the fuel pumps, the sewage systems of major cities. Million people means condemning an entire civilian population to living conditions that have not existed in the modern world since the 19th century. The Geneva Conventions have a name for this. It is called an attack against the civilian population. Legal scholars at the Center for International Policy in Washington, cited by Common Dreams, described Katz's words as an official declaration of intent to commit new war crimes in Iran, not the analysis of an activist. The analysis of specialists in international humanitarian law who examined an official ministerial statement and concluded that it announced war crimes. And what makes the situation even more serious is the legal context in which this declaration was made. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who leads the government of which Katz is a member, is already the subject of an international arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court in 2024 for alleged war crimes committed in Gaza. The defense minister of a government whose head is under international arrest warrant has just publicly announced that he is preparing new war crimes, and the international community is, for the most part, watching in silence. Now let us talk about consequences. Because a declaration of this type never exists in a vacuum, and you need to understand what can concretely happen in the weeks ahead. First, the Iranian response. Tehran reacted immediately. The Iranian Defense Ministry published a statement on April 25th claiming that the United States was looking for a face-saving exit from the war. But more importantly, the Katz declaration arrived at the exact moment when a wounded, isolated Mojtaba Khamenei had just transmitted a personal message to Putin. The Iranian calculation is now clear. If Iran must face a new wave of massive strikes explicitly targeting the Khamenei dynasty, Tehran can no longer settle for diplomatic coordination with Russia. It needs a far more formal protection arrangement, and that is precisely what is being assembled behind closed doors. Second, the Russian response. Remember what Russia said on April 27th. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov met his Iranian counterpart General Reza Taleghnik in St. Petersburg. Belousov officially declared that Russia supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran and is prepared to do everything necessary to help resolve the situation. The Katz declaration, which announces the destruction of that exact sovereignty and that exact territorial integrity, is a direct provocation against a Russian commitment made 4 days earlier. If Israel acts, Moscow will not be able to look away, not after publicly promising the opposite. Third, the American response, and this is probably the most complex point. Donald Trump is in a position of permanent ambiguity. On one side, he publicly amplified calls to kill Iranian leaders, declaring in substance on April 23rd that if Iran refuses to sign a deal, the whole country will explode. On the other, he announced that same day an indefinite extension of the ceasefire, creating space for negotiations with Tehran. He also said Russia could help him resolve the conflict while simultaneously telling Putin to finish his war in Ukraine before helping with this one. This ambiguity is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of strategic exhaustion. Trump no longer has a coherent plan. He oscillates between metaphorical nuclear threats and diplomatic promises. He allows his de facto defense minister, Israel Katz, to speak in his place about returning Iran to the Stone Age because he no longer has the political capacity to impose a clear American diplomatic framework. The result, the decision to restart the war, no longer depends on Washington. It depends on Tel Aviv. And Tel Aviv just published its operational roadmap. Now let us step back even further. Because what is happening with the Katz declaration tells us something about the current state of the international order. And what it tells us is disturbing. For decades, the targeted assassination of foreign leaders was a taboo even for the most aggressive military powers. The United States had an official prohibition on political assassination signed by President Gerald Ford in 1976. That prohibition was progressively eroded after 2001 with the War on Terror. But even in the most extreme cases like the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, the United States maintained a legal fiction that it was targeting an illegal combatant, not a political head of state. Today in 2026, a minister of a U.S. allied state is publicly announcing that he is preparing the assassination of the supreme leader of another UN member state. This is no longer a legal fiction. This is a declared intention. And the relative silence of the international community in response is what transforms a diplomatic incident into a strategic precedent. Because here is what every major power in the world is watching right now. If Israel can publicly announce that it is preparing the assassination of the Iranian head of state and no real sanction follows, then what was unthinkable 5 years ago becomes thinkable. And what is thinkable today becomes policy tomorrow. The line between conventional warfare and state-sponsored targeted assassination has just collapsed. Every foreign ministry on earth is recalculating its exposure. For Israel's enemies, the message is unambiguous. You are no longer safe, not even on your own soil, not even at the top of your own state. That logic inevitably drives authoritarian regimes to harden their protection mechanisms, to accelerate their nuclear deterrence programs, to draw closer to protective powers like Russia or China, which is the exact opposite of what Israel claims to be seeking with its strategy of physically eliminating enemy leaders. For America's allies in the region, the message is equally alarming. If Washington tolerates Tel Aviv publicly announcing such objectives without any diplomatic restraint, then the implicit promise of moderation that underpinned the American alliance is gone. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all of them are watching. All of them are drawing conclusions about what it actually means to be America's ally in 2026. What it means is that you could be next. And then there is the religious dimension, which must not be underestimated. Mojtaba Khamenei is not a head of state in the Western sense. He is also a religious dignitary who exercises spiritual authority over Shia Muslims across the entire world, a community of more than 200 million people, publicly threatening his assassination risks, transforming a regional geopolitical conflict into a global religious war. Every Shia community in the world, from Pakistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to Azerbaijan, is watching. And each of those communities contains people prepared to mobilize if their supreme leader is killed by an Israeli-American strike. This is precisely what Tel Aviv and Washington should be doing everything to avoid, and it is precisely what the Katz Declaration makes probable. Now let us look at the scenarios. Because the situation is extremely unstable and several paths forward exist. In the first scenario, Trump gives Israel the green light in the coming weeks. A new wave of massive strikes destroys Iranian energy infrastructure. A covert operation targets Mojtaba Khamenei. If this happens, Russia almost certainly activates its military support for Iran in a far more visible way. As 400 deliveries already under discussion become actual deliveries, hypersonic technology transfers accelerate. The conflict becomes potentially regional, with a proxy dimension between the two principal nuclear powers on Earth. In the second scenario, Trump refuses the green light. The Katz Declaration becomes a dead letter. Negotiations resume painfully under Pakistani and Russian mediation, but Israel emerges politically weakened with a defense minister who publicly announced an operation that his principal ally refused to authorize. This most peaceful scenario is also the one that puts the Netanyahu coalition in the greatest danger because it reveals that Israel can no longer act without explicit American permission. That is a major political humiliation for a country that has spent decades presenting itself as a strategically autonomous actor in the Middle East. In the third scenario, Israel acts unilaterally without waiting for American authorization. This is less probable but not impossible. If the Netanyahu coalition feels sufficiently threatened by Bennett and Lapid's gains in the polls, if it calculates that a spectacular military operation could reunify the country and reverse the electoral dynamic, the temptation to act alone exists. In that case, the entire diplomatic architecture of the region explodes, including the relationship between Tel Aviv and Washington. None of these three scenarios is reassuring. All of them carry major risks, and the international community, in its vast majority, is not sounding the alarm with anything close to the force this situation demands. That is precisely what needs to be remembered. When a defense minister of a state that presents itself as a Western democracy publicly announces the planning of a targeted assassination against the head of another state, and the international reaction amounts to measured diplomatic statements, it is the entire legal order of the world that is being weakened, not just the fate of Mojtaba Khamenei, not just the fate of Iran, the fate of the idea that there are still rules that states agree to respect in their relations with one another. That idea is the foundation on which the relative peace the world has known since 1945 was built. And that foundation is being publicly dismantled, brick by brick, statement by statement. The Katz Declaration of April 23, 2026 is one of those bricks. It may not immediately trigger the regional war it announces, but it moves the threshold of what is acceptable to say publicly by a member of a U.S. allied government. And every time that threshold moves, the next declaration becomes more brutal, more dangerous, more normalized. History teaches us something important about wars and their escalations. None was ever triggered by a single spectacular act. All were preceded by a series of declarations, threats, and provocations that gradually conditioned public opinion to accept the idea that the unacceptable had become acceptable. Once that conditioning is complete, the act itself appears only as the logical conclusion of a process that seemed inevitable. We are exactly in that phase today. The Israeli declaration of April 23rd is not an isolated event. It is a step in a process of verbal escalation that is preparing global public opinion to accept what was unthinkable 6 months ago. Killing the leader of a state, destroying the civilian infrastructure of a country of 88 million people, returning a nation to the Stone Age. Every one of these phrases spoken aloud by a minister is psychological preparation for the act that follows. And that is precisely why it is essential to talk about this now with clarity before these words become actions. Because once the actions are committed, there is no going back. And history will judge very harshly the societies that watched in silence while these preparations unfolded publicly in front of them day after day.